Yep, we're going live now.
All right. I think we can just wait about 2 minutes for people to join and then we'll start. Okay, I think we'll start now. So welcome everyone to the Open Grand Finals of Bangladesh UADC 2020. Congratulations to both teams for making it so far. In the government side, we have Taylor's 1, and in the opposition side, we have Ateneo de Manila 1. My name is Timkeen. I'm going to be chairing this debate. I use she or they pronouns, but whilst you are speaking, please do refer to the panel as a whole. Judging with me today are the following very esteemed people: Adi, Daniel, Hickory, Jami, Jess, Sordeep, Tashia, and Ufi. If they would now like to, in alphabetical order, unmute and introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Adi. I'll be one of the panelists. Good luck to both teams.
Hello everyone, my name is Daniel. I'm also on the panelist. All the best to both teams.
Hi everyone, my name is Jami. I'm going to be serving on the panel. My preferred pronouns are he or him. Good luck to both teams.
Hi everyone, my name is Jess, she or they. Good luck everyone as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Shodeep. I have no preference in pronoun. Best of luck to both the teams.
Hello, my name is Toshia Ozawa. I'll be paneling this round. I don't have particular preference for gender pronoun. Good luck to both teams. Thank you.
And finally, hi, this is Upi. Good luck to both teams and congratulations for making it this far. My preferred pronouns are he or they.
Hi, I'm Hikari. No preference. Congratulations for both teams.
So in that case, 2 points of order before we start. 1, I'm going to be timing you. I will indicate when you reach 1, 6, 7, 7:15 in the chat. After 7:15, all of us will stop writing. So I suggest that you stop speaking then as well. Second, please, before you start speaking, state what your POI preference is. So whether that be through the chat, audio, or video. Where you do not say so, the chat will be the default option. So I invite the Prime Minister then on the motion that in post-colonial states, this House supports militaries with strong national ideologies over militaries that see themselves as autonomous professional bodies to give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible? Okay. I'll take POIs in the chat, probably around after setup or close to 5:50. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm gonna prove 2 things in this speech. First, that a nationalist military is better in terms of reconstructing a post-colonial state where we become closer to forming unity governments or governments that allow civilians to have locus of controls over the military, thus reducing the need for civil conflict. Second, I'm going to explain why stability is significantly higher in the world of government, in a world where governments are aligned with state visions and state goals. The first question I want to answer is, what does a nationalist ideology-based military look like? The first characteristic is that these are no longer autonomous bodies. This means they are arms of the state that aim to guarantee the incentive structures and the aims of political states as well. This is in terms of assuring stability and also defending nation states against external and internal threats as well. Number 2, in terms of them being nationalistic, this just means they align themselves with common identities and the formation of common identities as well. This is to suggest in post-colonial states where states are actively forming unity identities or nationalistic identities, the military also follows this stream of characterization as well. This seeps into all forms of their incentive structures and mechanisms, in terms of the way they recruit, in terms of the way that they operate within a state, in terms of the way that they ally and carry out their daily duties as well. Now, let me go into the first issue. Let me talk about stability. The first reason as to why I think stability is not guaranteed in the world of opposition is because of the incentive structures that exist as a byproduct of these militaries being autonomous. Here are 5 incentive structures that come with them. The first thing that we need to note about an autonomous military is that their popularity and their acceptance with the general public is not aligned with the state to begin with. This is to suggest they have no incentive to guarantee that an executive government or a political party remains in power or is stably remaining in power. If there is an analogy that I could draw, it's the way judiciaries in the world operate. They are fairly independent. They don't care if a political or a judicial decision have much of a bad or negative impact on the state. Rather, they just operate aligning with the principles that they have basically created. The second thing, as a byproduct of them being a separate autonomous professional body, they oftentimes have the incentive structures to create separate cults or personalities to bolster their own popularity and acceptance amongst a general public. This is the way in many post-colonial states, many military generals and brigadiers were actively propped up as heroes by the military. This is also analogous to the way Pakistan's military actively props up generals as compared to individuals or prime ministers because they focus on their own cults or personalities, seeing as they are not aligned with the state. The third is, because they are autonomous in nature, their powers are autonomous as well. This is to suggest they take everything in their incentive structure to retain and preserve this autonomy to begin with. This means any complete rejection of any interference from civilian governments or any interference of potential external influences on government structures as well. The example of this is in Myanmar, whereas supposedly we have control over the military, but they actively do not want to liberalize and they also actively don't give off power to individuals. The fourth is, oftentimes in post-colonial states, these militaries are oftentimes the most well-funded, are oftentimes the most well-equipped with the resources of the state. The reason for this is because in the colonial struggle, because they were fighting off colonizers, governments oftentimes centralize all funds and resources towards making sure that the military is as powerful as possible so that we're successful in repelling British imperialism. In the alternate world where individuals have exited the colonial struggle, the military has the incentive to retain all of these resources because any loss of resources is taken as an attack on their autonomy and an inability to exercise their autonomy. Because if the military gives off resources, how do they defend themselves against a potential protest movement or a potential government that wants to strip them of this power to begin with? Given these are the incentive structures of how the military operates, and especially an autonomous one, what are the harms of this incentive structures? The first is because they are not aligned to nationalism or because they're not aligned to the general goals of the state, their goals are very much dedicated to making sure that the organization is as efficient as possible. Efficiency doesn't necessarily translate to what is good for a post-colonial state. So for example, it is oftentimes quite inefficient for a military to incorporate many different ethnicities as a byproduct of there being many differences, many potential skirmishes within the military, or people just defecting away because they feel like the military is too difficult. The comparative is, in a world where they are aligned with nationalism and a belief that they must align themselves with every active ethnicity in the group, they have a larger incentive to do recruitment based on incorporating or different types of ethnic groups as well. The example I have for you here is the way the South African military reformed after apartheid was broken apart. Because the military and the resistance was mostly fought by the economic freedom fighters that wanted a completely black military, it was only after input from the democratically elected Mandela administration that we were able to give entry points for white soldiers to enter the military. And the reason as to why the military, relative to the hellhole that is the corrupted South Africa right now, is trusted significantly more because it crosses across ethnic lines. This incentive doesn't exist in the world of opposition. Before I move to the second part, I'm happy to take a POI.
So this entire deals with the first part of the motion, which is autonomous, but does not engage with the second part of the wording, which is professional. To a degree that they're professionally oriented, why do these harms still continue to exist?
Yeah, because they are professional, they are loyal to themselves. Professionally, they conduct themselves in a way that's efficient, that doesn't necessarily align with state incentives. Thanks very much. Now, the second thing, here's the harm of them not being aligned with nationalist tendencies. The reality is this: in all post-colonial states, there is a winner and there is a loser. Oftentimes, these are decided across ethnic lines. And oftentimes, it is the dominant majority that forms the part or the biggest part of governance and militaries as well. The distinction here is that when militaries are not subjected to civilian control and not subjected to democratic controls as well, it is oftentimes not just seen as a separate, completely autonomous institution that is run solely by one race, but it is also one that is seen as highly resistant to change for all the incentives I laid out earlier. Why is this particularly harmful? Firstly, I think in an era where you are in post-colonialism and states are very, very fractured, this incurs a lot of resentment against the military, where many minority ethnic groups feel the need to split away from the state and form rebellion groups to fight against militaries to begin with. The comparative in our words, this doesn't exist. The third is because they are autonomous, because they want to protect their own interests, they carry out military coups all of the time. Anytime a state wants to liberalize and take resources away from the military, they overthrow this to retain their own perverse incentive. This is how all the oil wars in Congo happened and why we could not have a restructured democratic state, because they must protect their interests. Comparatively on all these grounds, a nationalistic military is one that aligns with political and state incentives. They are more representative, they are more accountable. For those reasons, we prefer them. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech and now invite the very honorable leader of opposition to give one not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I heard and seen? Okay, lovely. Since I'm live on Facebook, before I start my speech, I'd like to say thank you to my teammates for bringing me here, to my family who is very not sleekily snooping outside my door to my left. And I'd also like to thank my friends and my girlfriend for taking the time out of their day to watch me give a debate speech on Wednesday evening. So with all that said, before I start my speech, I'm also grateful to the tournament organizers. This is a lovely tournament. Okay, enough of the fluff. Let's start with the LO speech. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Some of the worst and most atrocious things in the world have been done in the name of the nation. We believe that a professional military will be less atrocious, will fight wars less, will fight wars in better ways, and will fight wars for less time. Before I start with this speech, I just want to do a few things in response. Firstly, I want to point out that they explain people will align themselves along common identities. Note that they can't fiat this. They align themselves specifically with nationalist identities. They don't give very many good reasons as for why these nationalist identities will be the interest of the average person. I will give an argument later explaining why that's not the case. Secondly, they explain then that efficiency is often not good for the interest of a post-colonial state. They give actually one example to prove this, which is that it might be inefficient to recruit the people of different ethnicities. This is literally the proof they give for the reason as for why they would therefore be disaligned from the interest of the state. Actually, on the other hand, it's far more efficient to get people of different ethnicities just because you get way more soldiers. And on comparative, it is nationalism that is far more likely to say these people are not of your ethnicity, these people are outsiders to your nation, and thus you should not recruit them. Moving on, I'll respond to the rest in my argument. First argument, we believe that nationalist ideologies make wars worse, make wars longer, and make them happen more often. First, we need to understand how nationalist ideologies affect the leadership and structure of a military. A lot of the time, nationalist ideology in post-colonial states is particularly problematic. Firstly, because the product of colonization is divide and conquer strategies. That is to say, liberalization was also often not done by mass struggle. It was done by the people who had the money to buy guns. Two, the dominant class was often the one that is given concessions by the oppressor colonial state. And thirdly, often it is in the interest of post-colonial states to use nationalism to the detriment and to the exclusion of minorities, to blame them for poverty and distract the average person from the excesses of the state. Moreover, nationalist militaries also have interest in self-glorification in the interests of the state. And moreover, since it can be hard to again restart the military, you will need someone to blame. These people are often the minorities on Gov's side. The problem is that people also of a particular ideology in post-colonial states are likely to be in charge of the military on Gov's side because of the fact that it's the military hierarchy of the largest ethnic group that is often preserved in these places. And I think on their side, we think the natural circumstance is that these people will be more nationalistically oriented on Gov's side. What are the impacts likely to arise from them being heavily invested in the nationalist identity of a state that may not be always good? Firstly, they are more likely to fight in more wars. Firstly, because their nationalist ideologies recruit people over the dream of defending their nature against their eponymous oppressor, as opposed to recruiting them on the basis of it might be a good job for you, this might be good for your future, or perhaps you're just doing something that you might like to do. The comparison is that their side means that people are far more likely to feel provoked over things like threats to sovereignty. People are far more likely to fight over territory, over perceived slights, especially historical ones, especially to your neighboring countries, especially to people you might dislike. This means that they're far more likely to start wars in the first place. And given that the link cuts both ways, that is to say that they also have an influence over civilian governments, this means that they're far more likely to provoke wars, either by, I don't know, holding the government at gunpoint, or alternatively using the leverage they have over the government to start more wars in the name of this interest. Secondly, they are likely to fight wars in worse ways. Some of the worst war crimes done, the massacres at Srebrenica, the killing fields, the use of napalm in Malaysia, chemical weapons and killing fields all over the world, right? We think this coincides with a belief in an overriding identity being more important than the sanctity of mankind and the dignity of rules of war. I want to note that the comparative on our side is that since they are professional, they are far more likely to follow the rules of war, not just because this is by definition of professionalism, which means that they follow the professional and technical ethical rules of it, but because the fact that the structures in place are far more likely to be strong and hold you to account. That is to say that they have a reputation to uphold, that they see themselves as professional and they would want to have this in their code of conduct. This means that you're far more likely to be court-martialed if you do a bad thing, by the way, which is one of the methods of one of the natural incentives for you to not do bad things that they take away on Gov side. But thirdly and lastly, this means that they're also far more likely to fight wars for longer. This doesn't just mean that they can garner up the stuff of nationalist fervor, which means that they're less willing to enter into negotiations, which means that they're willing to prolong conflicts and even do tactics like starve out the opponent and surround them. They're also more likely to invoke rage and enmity in the people that they oppress, again for the previous reason that they're more likely to do war crimes. But the third thing is that this makes it a war of ideology, not just a war between people on regrettable ends, on opposite ends of a regrettable battlefield. We think the comparative is that on their side, people are far more likely to feel personally slighted, are likely to hate the country as opposed to just the military. On all these three impacts, this is the most salient impact in this debate. One, because it harms way more innocents and it exposes them to the most egregious and atrocious things we have ever seen in the world. But moreover, it means that the countries are also far more likely to backslide in authoritarianism, which is a terrible impact. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from Gov. Yeah.
So in the world of opposition, the military is autonomous and has autonomous political incentives to defend, whether it's retaining the resources they have or making sure they are the most powerful. How does this translate to the state being stable and not incurring all of the harms you suggested?
Okay, so this comes in I'll come into direct response for this for the second part. So secondly, we also think that they're more likely to have worse things in terms of peacetime. Here, let's directly respond to the point that they want us to bring out, which is why professional states are more like why professional armies are more likely to be good. The first is that there are strong natural disincentives for autonomous bodies to engage in very, very risky things like coups. They see that there's a large expected value, but they don't explain the likelihood of getting that expected value, especially since they have less say over politics, especially since they have less say over the people in charge of them. This means that on comparison, actually what we think is that since they are already safe, there's no need for them to agitate more because they already have the money that they want. Notably, it is also a contradiction for them to say these people don't care about all this honor, they don't care about all this popularity stuff, but then they also say that one of the reasons why they will go into wars is because of the fact that they will be seen as heroes and be rewarded by the state. Surely as well, we also think that the more linked they are to the state, the more incentives authoritarians and politicians have to co-opt these people and attempt to bring them into the fold. Aside from the fact that we think it's a bad thing on the instances that some of these countries might be bad, on the instances that some of these people are bad, we think that the valences and the excesses of authoritarianism also become far worse. Not only because you can use this military against the minorities that you want, which means that in the case where these are taken over by populism, we think that militaries in general, since they don't want to oppress people, since it risks civil war, the loss of life, and because you yourself are the one fighting these wars, and you will be the one tried by international communities, as well as just generally a court-martial if you do war crimes, which we think that the average person in the military, as well as people on top, often don't want to go into wars. But when they are corrupted by that in the comparative, when they are corrupted by nationalist ideologies, this is when they are far more likely to forsake this professionalism and forsake their own personal safety in the interest of something greater, which is again the nation state. The last thing is also we think that again the natural disincentives for a military coup or all the things that they say on Gov might potentially be a bad thing, but are on comparative far less likely than into one where they see this. Then they might potentially see the state as one that is acting against nationalist ideologies, as one that is betraying the nationalist ideologies. So we think that on their side they permanently constrain democratic development on the basis of them being the wrong ideology. So they're afraid to go against what the state says. They're afraid to go against what the military says, which means that on their side the military actually exercises far more control. At the end of the speech, we do two very, very basic things. The first thing is we prove that this is far worse for the average person, and the second thing is that we prove this is worse for the nation. For these reasons, you must negate. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech and now invite the very honourable Deputy Prime Minister to give one not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Hello, let me set up my timer and drink some water. All right. Okay. Before I start my speech, I would also just like to say thank you. Sorry, everyone. This is my first major final. Big deal for me. I'd like to thank my amazing teammates who I couldn't have done this without. I'd like to thank Max, Amrit, Deb, Kelvin, Moops, all the senior debaters that have given me advice. I love you all. You all are the best. I'd like to thank my friends. Everyone's watching. I love you guys a lot, man. I have a lot of more fluffy things to say. I'll personally text you after this. I think I should get on to my DPM speech, which hopefully will be quite good. I quite like the look of it at the moment. All right, I'll start. Okay, guys. So, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The reason why the side of Op will lose this debate is because they were uncomparative to the incentives that these things have. What is the comparative that these militaries have? What is the comparative in this debate? One, you have an autonomous professional body that seeks efficacy and has self-interest. And the question the opposition has to answer is whether the self-interest will lead to better outcomes for the nation state or worse outcomes. The burden on the Gov then is to suggest, will the accountability of a nationalist agenda lead to more harm or more good for the nation state? Note, this debate then should be decided upon what is the nationalist agenda and what does this nationalist agenda make the military do. Because insofar as one, the individuals in the military itself care about the nationalist agenda, presumably if I prove that the nationalist agenda is a good thing, they will also act in accordance with those incentives. But even if they also have the same self-interested incentives we talk about, the fact that they are accountable to the nationalist agenda, the fact that they create cults of personality based off the nationalist agenda means we are more able to take bites out of their popularity, more able to hold them accountable when they prop themselves up as a military that needs to obey the nationalist agenda. There's one broad question I want to answer in this speech. Where is there more stability in the country? But before that, one thing that doesn't fit in. The argument from the previous speaker suggests things like, we'll fight more wars, we'll fight worse wars, etc., etc. First claim they make is that we will fight more wars. The first response I have is, note, if you listen to the language of the leader of opposition, he's talking about fighting wars in other countries. I don't necessarily understand why a post-colonial state that is recovering, that has no resources, that is trying to reduce all the ethnic conflict in their state, have an incentive to fight wars outside of their nation state. So I would argue, in terms of like a piece of framing, post-colonial states don't have an incentive to fight wars outside their state. They're more likely to focus on inter-ethnic conflict. The reason why this is important is because this then mitigates a lot of their incentives about why these militaries want to fight more wars to begin with. The second thing we will say is that the autonomous military also have an incentive to destabilize the state, to enrich themselves. Navin tells you that militaries want to enrich themselves. They want to gain more oil so they can gain resources. They want more control of territories so that it's easier for them to control land and to control areas so that there's less opposition to the military. The comparative is a world where there's a nationalist agenda. I think the conclusion to this response is essentially just that these incentives are symmetric. The question is, how does the nationalist agenda fit into it, which I'll answer later. The second thing I want to deal with is this whole argument about fighting worse wars. I have 3 responses. Firstly, I don't understand why if you care only about efficacy, you are likely to also care about human dignity. I think rather a world where you have to finish wars fast, a world where you feel as if if you're a professional body, which means your priority is to do your job as best as you can. Presumably that includes finishing wars quick. You're more likely to use napalm. You're more likely to do these horrible things because that allows you to finish the war faster. Secondly, we would argue that you can also get court-martialed in our world. We think that incentive is symmetric. I don't understand that argument there. But the last thing we will say is that it's comparatively easier to hold militaries accountable in our world for fighting worse wars because we can say you are actively harming your own people. The nationalist agenda you speak of, you're killing our people on the ground. You're violating our identity. You're doing the very same thing that our colonial masters used to do to us. The comparative is we can claim as citizens of the state that you have an obligation to protecting us. You have an obligation to reduce the loss of life in our state versus militaries that already have their own cults of personality, are not accountable to the people whatsoever, don't have to care about the nationalist agenda, which leads me very nicely to my first question, which is where is there more stability in the country on two levels? The first, in terms of military coups, the only analysis the previous speaker has to this argument is that militaries do things in the name of the nation, a lot of examples in history, therefore bad. Note that this is premised upon what the nationalist agenda is and what does it mean to fight in the name of the state. We think fighting in the name of the state is likely to be positive as opposed to cracking down on certain ethnicities and is likely to support and want to prop up governments and democracy and likely to be good in general for three structural reasons. One, because of the trauma that your colonizers inflicted on you, you are unlikely to want a takeover. You are unlikely to want the military to come and seize power, to patrol the streets, to reduce your ability to access the democratic freedoms that you fought so hard. We think that trauma of people, of the same people carrying guns controlling you means that you're unlikely to want to support the military coup. You're more likely to oppose it and hold these militaries accountable. Secondly, we just think generally people want more control of their lives. I think in a world where we move towards democracy, we are generally moving towards the path of accessing more freedoms for everyone as far as possible. The comparative is military setting very strict guidelines in order to ensure national security as opposed to allowing individuals to access the freedoms that they necessarily want. The third thing we will say is that your hatred of colonizers are likely to outweigh your hatred for certain ethnicities. So maybe there is a vested incentive for one ethnicity to gain power in our world, but we think the nationalist agenda means you're able to weaponize anti-colonial rhetoric to ensure that the nationalist agenda is one that is more unified, and at least in the short-term colonial post-colonial reconstruction, we are unified somewhat, and we are more unified in a world where we can weaponize that anti-colonial rhetoric and suggest this is the nationalist agenda that is more likely to be unity in our. So the conclusion to this response is that fighting in the name of the nation is likely to be more good than bad because these are the incentives that propel these militaries and also the incentives for civilians to hold these militaries accountable and ensure they don't screw up society. No, they also have no response whatsoever to a vast amount of things that Navin tells you about the incentives of an autonomous body to enrich themselves, to be as efficient as possible, and to generally be self-interested and have no wanting to prop up civilian governments and so on. No, Navin makes something. So even if you don't believe there's more military coups in our world, there's likely to be things like military coups and transfers of power in both worlds. The comparative is likely to be better in our world when militaries are less self-interested and are more willing to prop up civilian governments, are more willing to support unity governments because they don't mind if they take a hit in their power, rather they care more about the broad nationalist agenda. And again, I want to repeat, even if they are still self-interested, the fact that they prop up cults of personality, they advertise themselves as having a nationalist agenda, it's easier for us to hold them accountable for it. It's easier for us to call them out for being assholes. There's just a marginal increase in accountability in our world, even in our worst case. The second thing I want to do is talk about inter-ethnic conflict. Navin tells you we don't include as many ethnicities as we should because it leads to a lack of efficiency. They say, oh, but we want more people. So one, we have enough people in the majority ethnicity which currently control the military to have enough people for the war, especially given the context. It's not an inter-nation war, it's just a civil war. Secondly, I think the fear of them leaking intelligence, the fear of them defecting back to their old tribe is a bigger fear because it harms a lot of people, right? So one addition to your military isn't worth screwing over entire military operations, entire mission plans and information. Even if you don't believe this, note the context Navin gives you suggests that these autonomous militaries want to end wars fast for efficiency. The comparative in our world is people care somewhat about healing, they care somewhat about nationalist agenda. Even if there's more harm in the short term, there is more desire to move towards unitary governments, more desire to move towards long-term healing, long-term change. For all these reasons, Gov takes this debate. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech and now invite the very honorable Deputy Leader of Opposition to give one not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible? All right, hold on. Let me just get the video up. Just fix my papers. All right. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Talk about three things: unity, war, and the capacity to hold the military accountable. So, look at the characterization of nationalist ideology. It's incredibly convenient, but note that there's an incredibly irrational nature towards the building of nationalist ideology in post-colonial states, particularly when associating them to the military. Firstly, you want to ask who has the most capacity to be able to contribute to military struggle against colonial power. It is often enriched enriched in majority dominant cultures, which often were able to give the most military resources, such that if you associate nationalism with the ability to fight and to militarize, these are often the people you are most often likely going to heroize, rather than minority groups who have little to no capacity to fight that kind of fight. Secondly, it is a culture of machismo. A lot of the time, the military leaders that fight are not only majority male, but espouse male values. Things like the restriction of freedom because you believe that you must follow an incredibly hierarchical code. Things like being able to go against sexual minorities, women, and other kinds of minority groups because you believe that these kinds of nationalism must be able to be built on what is necessary to fight the struggle. So, if it is untrue then that their nationalism is so all-encompassing, is so likely to be able to unify the nation, create stability, that's likely the case. In fact, it is often the guise of stability in which militaries are often feel that they are justified in being able to take down minority groups because they are insurgents, because they are harming the nation, and in the sense that these people no longer uphold the values of nationalism. I would say unity is far worse on their side than on ours. Their side is incredibly dependent on a very convenient characterization of nationalist ideology, when a lot of the time association of nationalist ideology in both post-conflict states as well as with the military can be very toxic and dangerous. Secondly, on accountability. Note that they characterize that they should have a semblance of control over the military. I disagree that this is the case. In fact, I'd argue it's the opposite. The military controls governance on their side of the debate. No, they don't have to go over and control the country on our side because we already give them that kind of autonomy, right? They can do the things they want. They have a separate budget. Most especially, they are not constrained by a civilian population. They cannot say that they depend so much on popularity, but at the same time, they're for some reason unaccountable. I would agree. They don't need popularity. They don't need to be popular. But that's precisely the reason you don't need to take over the government on our side. On their side, it is the belief that they are constrained, that moreover, because they contribute to a lot of nationalist values, which means that they are justified in being able to interfere in political affairs, that these people are heroes and ought rule the nation, which is why, for example, Indonesia, up until Jokowi, has had so many military leaders because you attach them to the value of nationalism. Same with Pakistan that they give as an example. They ask, why won't they gain power on our side? Because the strive for autonomy is likely to be not mutually exclusive. We give them that rather than give them incentives to be able to forcibly take it. Because the nature of a civilian population you cannot control means that all these people are risking their lives for something they are completely unaware about. There are significant incentives to want to control the civilian population on their side of the house. Secondly, if they believe that the military is abusive on both sides, I think autonomy allows for disentanglement. It is when you justify their existence in things like national politics and governance that you not only have military control over a lot of political affairs, but you give them the control over things like speech. You give them control over freedoms and the capacity to have political prisoners. I would say in both sides, if we have such an abusive military, it is far better when we do not give them the powers of governance because they will be voted in, they are likely to be heroized by a population that associates them as national heroes. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Navin's example of the judiciary is wonderful for golf because it proves that a nationalism that is incredibly irrational when the populace is unwilling or unlikely to make good decisions is better than to be able to relay such decisions to the people who are far more likely to be expert. And here's what I want to talk about Hans, just completely washing away the incentives for war. He says, why would they have war? They are incredibly poor. It is precisely that they are poor that they will have war, because poverty is often a showing of the structural failures of the government. But you know that you can distract them if you cause a war, if you rile up nationalist sentiments, you tell everyone you can fight against a greater power that ignores a lot of the greater structural problems that exist within a post-colonial country. And therefore, gives significant incentives to want to pursue war if it is tied to nationalism. Insofar as we see this as a separate, as a different body that does not attach to our own personal values, it is far easier to call this out, want to pursue more development policies, want to get smarter economic policy, rather than be distracted by the boogeyman of some other external source wanting to fight whatever colonial power, when often this is used as a guise to be able to prevent people from looking at the much more deeper state failures. And if it's important to be able to build a post-colonial state as a result of that, we win that clash then. I'll take a POI.
In a world where autonomous militaries want to enrich themselves, gain control of territory, and exert autonomous power over regions, in our world, the civilian population can constrain their ability to do that. In your world, they can't.
So firstly, you have a significant control, because nationalism isn't just you think that they attach the national identity. You attach national identity to them as well. So it's unlikely you have an incredibly critical, incredibly, you don't have the full capacity to constrain them at all times. Insofar as you attach them as heroes, you valorize them all the time because they significantly contribute to nationalism. But if that were true, what I literally just proved is that it is bad, because people can often make bad decisions, because God never defends what kind of nationalism they have, and therefore it's unlikely that they have the idealist nationalism that cuts across all characterizations, all identities. In fact, it's more often divisive when attached to incredibly machismo and exclusive sort of military. Lastly is on war. The first thing I want to ask is, how do they get the military to follow ethical standards? The first thing I'll do is some rebuttal. They say we're going to prioritize efficiency, and that's bad, because we'll just do everything we want that is incredibly dangerous. Not true. If you are incredibly abusive, if you use excessive force, that often prolongs wars, because it makes the other side far more likely to be angry, far more willing to fight, and therefore military generals know that this is often unstrategic in being able to follow war. But moreover, I would say it is on their side where you have an incentive to want to prolong war, to be able to rile up nationalist sentiments, to feel like we can come together as a nation during war times, that it is less likely that you can limit the loss of life. But secondly, it is so hard for them to follow ethical standards on their side, because on our side, if you see them as a separate body, whenever they are doing human rights abuses, whenever they are cracking down on minority groups, we can say that they are terrible human beings. On their side, when you view them as heroes, when you say they are contributing to a nationalist culture, or that the people they are killing and abusing are enemies of the state, are outsiders to the state, I do not care if they were tortured, killed, or incredibly abused. It is just because these are national heroes who are doing it. I would say then these kinds of ethical standards are less likely to be followed. Take note, a lot of their case is hinged on an incredibly idealist form of this nationalism. They don't prove it, but insofar as it is true that you have some constrainment from the civilian population, it's more likely that the military tries to control that population in order to gain more autonomy. I am very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech, and now call upon the very honorable government whip to give one not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible? Good stuff, thank you. Okay, please come. I want to start my speech off with just a very important framing, because I think this debate is slowly becoming a little bit unhinged. The first thing that I want to say is this debate exists in a post-conflict state, which likely has weak institutions, conflict in every corner, strong degrees of ethnic tension even within the country. There is a lot of potential as a military entity to want to entrench your power at every corner. So the model that the military has, whether it be a self-serving model or a nationalist model, the debate must be arbitrated on whether or not the military has a a likelihood to want to give up that power. There's a likelihood to have a tolerance towards post-building or post-conflict reconstruction in a way that allows autonomy to exist within the society and to give civilians that power. At this specific juncture, opposition has yet to answer the question of why the self-serving autonomous body, be it somewhat professional, is going to have incentives to want to let go at some point, has incentive to want to allow these states to reconstruct. At that juncture, we are absolutely freaking winning this debate. I have a couple of things that I want to do in clarification before I move on to two questions in my speech. Firstly, with regard to whether or not nationalist militaries are likely going to inflare more tension, and secondarily, whether or not we get more accountability, dealing directly with all the material that comes out in Naveen's speech that you don't deal with, i.e. things like the acceptance of civilians on the ground, conflict resolution in specific areas as a consequence of you having buy-in from a diverse group of like military, and also lastly with regards to why there's the incentive that aligns with building a nation and why we think that's significantly better as opposed to their model of hoarding resources, constantly treating the state as an adversary and not allowing to any ability for you to take power. In instances where you take power, you stage a military coup as a cop-out mechanism. The first thing I want to clarify is what is the nationalism that we're talking about? Because I think conveniently misreps this, right? In prep, I even told Naveen and Hans, the word nationalism has horrible stereotypes. In this debate, going to miss that. This is exactly what happened. Because in this debate, we specifically told you that nationalism means as a post-conflict state, you want to rebuild your identity. You want to rebuild your state. You have trauma from your colonizers. That is where military entirely defines themselves on nationalism. It means that they have an incentive to want to see the state becoming functional and have sustainable power within the state. For these reasons, the nationalism that exists within a military entity in a post-conflict state is likely going to want to let power go towards the civilians and let some degree of ability for autonomy to shift away from the state towards people power or towards seeing some degree of functional government, i.e. things like unity governments or civilian-led governments, which is what happened in South Sudan because the government, because the military were willing to let go as a consequence of wanting to see the country become significantly better. That is the nationalism that exists under our world. We've already given you incentives to explain why the nationalism is likely going to exist in our world. They cannot just go away by saying things uncharitably, such as nationalism is all negative and people have done horrible things in the past as a consequence of nationalism, not engaging with the specific context. Two questions that I want to ask in my speech. Firstly, with regards to why we think a nationalist military is likely not going to be more conflict or has affinity towards creating more conflict. The extent of analysis and response that we got is just that, they are professional, so therefore they're going to not want to do things like war crimes. Dearest God, the first thing that I would say is professional means that maybe you're technocratic, you are tactical. It doesn't mean suddenly you're all assuming of responsibilities and you're this benevolent military that wants to follow every single code of ethics that exists. The second thing, there are so many professional militaries that exist in the world right now, i.e. the United States freaking military, which is entirely a professional body that conducts humanitarian violations left, right, and center. Abu Ghraib still existed, Guantanamo Bay still existed. All of this means that your professional body still can exist in a circumstance where there's no transparency of what's happening on the ground and therefore manifest in terms of like violations against humanitarian rights as well. But the third thing we told you is that oftentimes you are self-servingly professional. This means that you have an incentive to want to continue hoard your power and entrench your power in the long run within this government. So I don't know why they have an incentive to want to let go of power at any point in time. But the last thing we told you, we'll tell you, is that I think in a world where you are a professional military, it is also a world where you can still continue to justify wars as well, which is why we told you under their world, you would have things like the professional military body or autonomous military body wanting to still see more tensions and wanting to still see more religious conflict on the ground so that they can justify their continued presence in this area, justify continued presence and continued sucking of resources from all of these entities as well. As a consequence of that, the outcome is number one, the state itself does not have access to resources to do things like post-conflict reconstruction, to form a common unified identity, and must constantly deal with the fact that there exists an autonomous military body that wants to entrench individual power and independent power. The second thing that we told you is with regards to the issue of whether or not you're able to get conflict resolution on the ground. This is incredibly important because when we told you that your autonomous military doesn't have an incentive to want to have a diverse military force that includes multiple different ethnicities, the extent of response we get just from LO is just that, numbers are important. Therefore, they would still want to get numbers under the hour. This is uncomparative to Naveen's speech when he told you, number one, that there is a threat of defecting when you include people who are in different ethnicities that you may have conflict with. Number two, there is distrust of ethnic groups, and as a consequence of that, your autonomous bodies are likely going to be led by specific majority groups or specific ethnic groups, and as a consequence, don't have an incentive to want to be diverse. The issue and the upshot of this is that number one, you don't have the ability to sort of like resolve conflict in incredibly important regions. You would have things like, for example, mass distrust of the military on the ground as a consequence of it being an undiversified group, self-serving group of wanting to enter into regions specifically. That's how you get things like rebel groups against the state. That's how you get terror offshoots. That's how you have mass recruitment of terror groups against the state, against the military, and you don't get any ability to get post-conflict reconstruction. But the second thing we told you is that there exists an incentive under our world to want to align with the building of the nation. This is for four structural reasons. The first is because there is some ability for you to want to let go of power down the road. There's this junk under their world with the state's incentives of wanting to rebuild a nation and the ability for the military to like want to resonate with that specific narratives in a world where there is a resolution. Before that, I'll take a PY, sure.
So if it is the case that militaries are self-serving on both sides, and on your side they have influence over the kind of nationalism that comes up, surely that means on your side they have the interest to make nationalism more belligerent.
Yeah, but like they don't, because of the fact that nationalism means that you want the state to eventually become a functional state. You want to fight the idea that colonizers have ruined your country and as a consequence don't have the ability to move on. Your world, your autonomous self-serving governments are more like autonomous self-serving militaries are likely to stage coups against your government at the point in which they want to take resources from you, at the point in which they argue, aha, it's time for the military to take a step back. Look at how Myanmar right now has entrenched military power in the parliament. A lot of important decisions people couldn't make it because the military has entrenched themselves in that power and not allowed for these democratic structures to take power against it. A self-serving military power is one that wants to entrench power. As a consequence of that, you don't have the ability to spend that resources in other areas as well. But the last thing we told you is that oftentimes it's incredibly important as this military group that is autonomous to want to continue to take away the ability for conflict resolution to happen in the long run. No post-conflict state can resolve a conflict, and as a consequence of that, the autonomous military would have no ability to exist in this particular region or have entrenched and the ability to take more resources in the long run. So for all these reasons, number one, we've told you on the ground, there's an incentive to want to fix conflict. Number two, there's an incentive to want to let go at some particular point. Without all of these, you would have a self-serving military under their world, which wants to have continuous presence in this post-colonial states. We regret that.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech and now call upon the very honorable opposition whip to give one not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible? Okay, I will. Hello, is this still audible? Okay. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want to thank myself because I'm going to be incredibly charitable to the government bench in today's debate and explain to you why we still clearly win. The first thing I want to do is explain why the issue that Plupi claimed they clearly won is actually lost by their side quite clearly. So they say, if you're an autonomous military, you have an incentive to preserve your autonomy. Therefore, when your autonomy is challenged, you're likely to rise up in arms against the government and therefore create a coup. You know what's the missing link of analysis here? The missing link is, why the hell will your autonomy be challenged if, one, you perceive yourself as autonomous already, and the military is inherently structured in that country to be a way to be autonomous already? This is important because the desire for autonomy, I agree, exists on our side. But there's a converse desire they have also on their side, which is the propagation of a nationalist ideology. Notably, both of them can be potentially threatened. And it's far more likely that there's a greater threat to the probability for you to perpetuate your nationalist identity. And that's why you want to be able to take arms over the government, or at least align with the current political leaders over the threat to your particular autonomy. And the reason for this is, for your autonomy to be challenged as a military, it literally requires the civilian government to rise up in arms and challenge your particular power. The difference, however, is that if it's aligned to political parties and you're aligned to political interest, the civilian government just has to change particular governments. So yes, you agree. You have one conception of a nationalist ideology. That's not the only conception of a nationalist ideology, and there are multiple in a particular state. So at the point where someone challenges your nationalist ideology, tells you that you're electing another person, or because they want to define nationalism by virtue of multiculturalism versus a particular religion, etc., that's when you still feel the need to be threatened, and therefore that's you're far more likely to do things like rise to power, far more likely to do things like prop up your current leader right now and prevent any other future election because it harms your nationalist ideology. So both sides, if you're a self-interested military, which is their best characterization, you want to preserve it. The deadlock breaking analysis is whether or not you're far more likely to be threatened. It's significantly great if you align yourself with political interest versus your independence as a military interest under our said house. That's why we're clearly winning that issue. But secondly, note that there is a natural limit to autonomy. That is to say, you have a certain amount of resources, you have a certain amount of independence, you can control your budget, etc., and control your goods and services. There is no natural limit to national ideology, right? To a degree, if you want to continue perpetuating ideology, that's when you want to crave for even more and more power, because that's the only way for you to be able to control all of these state institutions. That was the analysis coming from Miko that does not responded to by government whip. That's why on this issue about whether we're able to reduce authoritarians, the analysis coming from David and Miko take us this debate already. But before I move on, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Autonomous means that you have your own separate agenda and goals, which is why they want long-term entrenchment of power under your will. This is why it's contrary to states that want to take oil mines away from you and resources away from you, given that they are finite resources. That's how antagonization against the state exists.
Okay, autonomous does not equate to selfish. Yes, you have your own capacity. So the qualifying of your intent is the fact that you're professional. And this is where I deal with then the second point about where do we reduce conflict. Because there's an absurd understanding of professionalism coming from the government bench. They say professionalism is defined by how effective you are as a leader. Note that if a lawyer does unethical practices, a doctor does unethical practices, even if they have the highest conviction rates or the highest cure rates, or even debaters who are good but they cheat because they Google, we don't call them professional, because a part of the axis of professionalism is your efficacy. The other axis is your ethical standards that you're able to fight for. That is why, to a degree, they don't engage with the fact that professionalism includes restricting your military behavior, not doing war crimes, protecting the Constitution, which are all standards adopted by like the professional codes of militaries right now. A lot of their harms about abuses are actually far more likely under their side of the house when they're not restricted by this barrier of professionalism. They respond to this by saying they're bad examples like the US professional military. Who the hell said the US had a professional military? I don't think that's true. It's not an example to prove that professionalism does not apply under their said house. This analysis is important, but I want to be very, very charitable to them. Even if you believe that professionalism is only about self-interest and efficacy, we explain to you why a lot of the efficacy analysis aligns with the fact that you're able to protect a lot of minority interest groups. And this really break it down to different standards. Firstly, upon entering into war, we said you have a greater incentive to fight wars. One, because it creates national pride, but secondly, it allows you to create a national identity. The response coming from Hans is you're poor, so you won't fight. We explain that it's because you're poor, you're likely to fight. But secondly, if you care about your nationalist ideology, you probably care more about the fact that people are united under one banner nation, as opposed to the economic incentives of your particular area. But lastly, this just explains why you're not able to fight other countries, not why you declare wars within your own people, because you might believe that there's threats to domestic issues, and therefore you're so likely to enter into conflict. The response in comparison is that they say that national ideology is non-militaristic. This is ludicrous. A lot of the post-colonial revolutions were won by violent revolutions or uprisings. It's unclear why they don't celebrate militaries under their side. Or the analysis that they say that they're traumatized by the military, that's why they'll be against it, is just ridiculous too. They're traumatized against the colonial military, not their own military, who they see as saviors who liberated them. So in fact, the desire for the response to trauma is a desire for national security, national protection, and that's why you're far more likely to enter into conflicts. The response to professionalism is that there's no incentive because it's not aligned with national ideology. But secondly, the fact that if you enter into conflicts as a professional military, more of your soldiers are harmed unnecessarily. We're not really able to gain anything from it because a lot of the gains from conflict are for the nation state, not the particular autonomous group. That's why we enter into less wars. The second point we talked about was taking down particular minorities. The analysis of Naveen, which said that ethnic majorities take over the government in post-colonial states, proves that national ideology under their side is inherently exclusionary to a lot of the minority groups. The analysis coming from Miko about why you have a culture of machismo and national ideology shows why they're likely to be exclusionary. But even if you take the best case coming from Plupi, that it's about people caring about the nation state and their nation interest, a lot of times that has to be interpreted in the lens of what the military thinks is within the nation's interest. And a lot of times that's doing things like keeping law and order, taking down dissidents because they're harmful to the creation of order within a state. That's why it's inherently exclusionarity. The comparative is, even if you believe that professional soldiers are not at all ethical, the fact that they don't want to harm other minority groups, because if they enter into conflict against them, any rebellion, even if it's not that strong, might potentially harm their own interests because they lose their own soldiers, means that they have self-interested incentives not to do so. But lastly, even if both sides are exclusionary, we told you why professionalism has standards of war that you have to uphold, means that you're far less likely to do things like war crimes. You're far less likely to do things like torture individuals. So even if you're exclusionary on either side, the harm or the comparative of harm is significantly less. In what was probably a great debate, I think we still clearly won by virtue of the charity that we provided, and that's why we're very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech. And now to wrap the debate up substantively, for the opposition side, I invite the opposition reply speaker. Hear, hear.
Hello. Am I audible? Awesome, thanks. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I find the Gov case very weird. In our world, the military is incredibly power hungry, will give no means possible until they take control of power. In their world, they will give up and give it to the civilians. It's unlikely that they are likely to take this sitting down, which is why I was able to particularly argue that on either side there is a strife for autonomy. It is only the inability for us to be able to provide it, to create structures around that autonomy, that they want to be able to control civilian populations, and they feel justified in intervening in political affairs, that is therefore harmful, because on both sides of this is a terrible military, the increase in power of not only military power, but as well as state power and control over the media, control over speech and dissent, is far more dangerous coming from Gov. But note as well, they say at GovWhip that there are weak democratic institutions within this country. They preface all of their arguments by saying that you want to be able to have a civilian control over the military. Insofar these two are true, at best this is incredibly ineffective, but at worst, what I tell you at depth is to be able to say that people are incredibly uncritical of heroes, are incredibly uncritical of people who have given everything to the country and give them significant amounts and degrees of power on their side. Beyond that, we give incentives not to have to need this, right? Because number one, being able to have civil strife is against your own interest as a military group, unless you feel constrained, and that's the only reason why you'd be pushed to be able to do that, which we explained at first and third. I don't think that's very fair. So, we took the trade-off. We said we are much less likely to have a say in military decisions. They presume that accountability in and of itself is always a good. It is only a good if the people holding you accountable are able to make smart and rational decisions and are able to gear you towards the best version of that accountability. There are two ways in which we question that. The first is to say the propensity for war is far greater on Gov, because it is precisely that you are poor that nationalism often distracts a lot of these structural failings of the state. And if Hans says it's important to be able to pursue these development policies, it's far less likely to do that because whenever the state fails, there's an incentive to wage war as a result. But conversely, what we argued is that it's simply not within your interest to be able to pursue war at all times, because you're losing parts of your base, you might put yourself in danger. But the point in which you are significantly have control over the government, are amenable to the people, and need to raise your popularity, that's when you're far more likely to pursue war as a result. But secondly, on ethical standards, note that they just completely ignore the word professional in this debate. You cannot call the US military professional. I just very much so disagree with that. But secondly, I think it is noting not just that they are professional, but the lack of capacity for civilian populations to feel like the people committing all these rights abuses are not heroes. It is their inability to recognize that they are terrible human beings whenever they do these things, rather than fighting the villains that we must, which we must quash, which we must harm at all instances. It is the ability to tie this to nationalism that often destroys the capacity for people to think critically about the actions that these kinds of military soldiers take on, and makes it very difficult to be able to make sure the conduct of war at the very least is better. I think they lose that as well. Secondly, they want to talk about stability. The first thing here is unity. Again, this is incredibly dependent on the most convenient kind of nationalism that is incredibly inclusive, with which we argue, even if it was super good nationalism, it does not lead to smart decisions and incurs all the harms in the previous issue. But secondly, we constantly challenge this nationalism was good in and of itself, because a lot of the time, if you build it around militants, it is constructed around the people of the largest capacity for militants, for belligerents, and often that was dominant groups with the most resources for military and arms, or men and their capacity to enshrine male values. That is also dangerous for the protection of minority groups on their side of the debate. I don't think they're able to garner more stability. But secondly, insofar as we prove as well that even if it was efficiency that these groups are after, it is knowing that being too aggressive, using way too much force, is likely to be endorsed by nationalism, which is, encourages this, is likely to gain off of this kind of force. But on our side, it is knowing that it is instead controlled by military generals who want the most efficient outcomes possible, that are less likely to want to pursue incredibly dangerous and indiscriminate means of warfare that is more likely to create stability on our side. We achieve their goals, but they take little to no trade-off as a result. We don't need to hold them accountable, because the nature of accountability on their side is dangerous, it is ethnic, it is incredibly totalitarian. Before I end, I just want to say thank you to everyone who supported Ateneo and who's watching the stream right now. Thank you as well to Taylors. I'm very happy to see you guys in the final. In particular, Hans, man, you come so far from the World Schools days. It's very nice to share a dev exchange and reply exchange with you. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech, and to wrap the grand finals up, I invite the proposition reply speaker. Here.
Hello. I assume I'm audible. All right. Before I start my speech, I'd like to say thank you, Miko. It's really cool getting this far with you. I love you too, man. This is such a wholesome final. I love it. Okay. Excellent. Now, seriously. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. As wholesome as this final is, there's only one victor, and that's us. There's one question we have to answer in this debate. What are the incentives of autonomous bodies and the nationalist agenda? Where do we have greater incentives to prop up stability? The first question we have to answer is, will this nationalist agenda be good in regulating militaries that have a strong nationalist agenda? The opposition posed two incentives of this nationalist agenda. One, that it is majority dominant. We have two responses to this. One, it is worse in your world, because in both worlds, one ethnic group is likely to already have control of the military due to greater access of resources, etc., etc. The difference in our world is that when we care less about efficiency and more about the inclusion of as many people as possible, because we told you, if the more people we include, the more capable we are of constructing a national agenda, the more capable we are of reducing rebel offshoots. That means we are more likely to include more people. It's less majority dominant. The second thing we told you is there's a greater incentive to cater across ethnic lines in our world, because as I said, we want to include as many people in this national agenda to reconstruct identity. The second incentive they give you is that there's a culture of machismo. I think this is symmetric in both worlds. I don't think they ever proved why it's mutually exclusive. We gave you three competing incentives that were unresponded to. One, that the trauma of colonizers means that you're likely to not want inter-ethnic conflict. You're likely to want to nation build and thus include more people. Secondly, people whose freedoms have been stripped from them, people who have been attacked, violated, care most about accessing their democratic freedoms, being able to conduct themselves as they wish in the state, and thus are likely to care more about the access of that personal freedoms versus taking away freedoms from other people. The last thing we told you is because of the horrible things the colonizers did, not only does this lead to trauma, but this strong hatred of the colonizers mean that in this short period of time where we're reconstructing post-colonial societies, this hatred for colonizers outweighs our hatred for other ethnicities. Thus, we are likely to be able to create a good national agenda. This just means we're able to use that national agenda to hold militaries more accountable and to function along this version of national agenda. The conclusion is national agenda. Great. The second question under this is, what are the incentives of the autonomous military? They say two things about this. The first is, if you are not constrained by civilian populations, what incentive do you have to create a coup? We gave you two responses. One, regardless of whatever it is, you have an incentive to be as well funded as possible, to control as much territory as possible, and to consistently justify your presence there, which can only happen through through increased conflict, or even if not increased conflict, some pressure, some need for instability, or some existence of instability. No, even in our worst case, where they don't want instability, they're eventually forced to hoard power. Insofar as they're independent, and eventually Plupi and Navin tell you that you have to end up giving power, because a necessary thing of post-conflict, a post-colonial reconstruction is eventually giving more and more power to civilian governments. We told you there's more incentive to give up this power in a world where you care more about the nationalist agenda that we talk about. The comparative in your world is less incentive to do that, because you want to be autonomous, you want to be independent, you want to maintain power in these regions for as long as humanly possible. The second thing they say is this nonsense about being professional. One, just because an entity is professional doesn't mean they always obey professional guidelines. If they always obey if everyone always obeys guidelines, there's no freaking debate, right? Because our state militaries will also obey the laws, the Geneva Convention that governs them. Thus, the question in this debate must be, where are we able to deter militaries through accountability? What incentive structures are better? Where is there less incentive to violate these guidelines? We tell you in our world, where we care more about rebuilding and healing as opposed to efficiency and things like that. What does this mean? Why do we win this debate? Three reasons. One, there's a greater incentive to create instability through military coups in their world. Secondly, there's more hoarding of resources through oil and land. That means it's harder to construct civilian governments. And lastly, even if you don't believe all of that, there's more inter-ethnic conflict in their world, because the military wants to fix the country because of national agenda. In our world, they enter the region and want to stop inter-ethnic conflict. In your world, self-serving militaries constantly want to hoard resources and justify their continued presence. They have less incentive to solve inter-ethnic conflicts. Even if they're altruistic, we told you that it's more likely for people with a nationalist agenda to solve inter-ethnic conflicts, because they unite people, because they care more about reconstructing identity as opposed to solving the conflict fast and making sure one person wins over another. This debate has many permutations of reality. There are a great number of comparatives, but there's only one constant in all these realities, that Taylor's is the winner of UADC. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech and thank everyone for that excellent debate. Please cross the floor virtually and bump fists/shake hands. As this is in fact a closed round, you will find out later in the closing ceremony who has won.